Hi everyone, it's Katie and Owen, and welcome to Hospitality 101 at St. Barnabas. Over the next 15 minutes, we want to introduce you to practices of welcome and community building for our congregation. So many members of our church have told us how they consider hospitality to be one of our greatest strengths. Many can remember a specific individual or a group of people who welcomed them warmly and who helped make this place feel like home. And you know what? We agree. St. Barnabas is a welcoming congregation, and we celebrate the ways people of this church have lived that out over the years.
But as with all practices of faith, we can always learn more and grow. It is because we care so much about hospitality that we should take time to intentionally reflect on the things we do well and discern the ways we can do better. After all, God's greatest commandments are to love God and love our neighbors, and within the walls of the church, one of the ways we can love one another is to tend to our practices of hospitality.
So that's what we will talk about today. Best practices for welcoming visitors and longtime members alike, some theology of hospitality, and also ways to be sensitive to historically marginalized people within the church. We're asking all of our church leaders, elders, deacons, trustees, staff, greeters, ushers, and more to review this information as part of the service to the church. But we also encourage everyone to watch as part of their own involvement in our community of faith.
Let's talk about Sunday mornings first. This is where we as a congregation see each other most often, and very often, it is the first encounter visitors will have with the church. Coming to Sunday school, worship, and fellowship events on Sunday mornings are meant to be fulfilling to us and our own faith, but we are also called to care for each other, especially when we serve in leadership positions. Here are 8 do's and don'ts, or best practices for showing hospitality that apply specifically for Sunday mornings or other community-wide events at the church building. 1. Do introduce yourself if you don't know someone you pass by. Greet them and tell them your name. Hey there, I'm Owen. How are you doing? Even if it is a quick conversation in passing, be sure to ask their name also. It might seem simple, but if you go to pretty much any setting, not just church, people almost universally experience a brief welcome and sharing of names to be calming and invitational. It shows that people care about you as a person, not just as a customer or participant. It is an invitation into a community, which is what we are all about. 2, don't be afraid of greeting somebody twice. One thing we often hear is people's fear of greeting someone as a first-time visitor only to find out that they've been members of the church for years. And I get it. I feel the same way sometimes as a pastor, but truthfully, it is very rare for people to feel upset being welcomed warmly too many times. Even if you say to someone, "Hi, I'm Owen, is this your first time here?" and they respond with, "Oh, I've actually been attending for a while," you don't need to apologize. Just respond with something like, "It's so nice to meet you then. How are you?" It is a blessing that St. Barnabas is large enough for people not to know every other member, so don't hesitate to greet someone just because you can't remember if you've met yet. 3, do ask if you can be helpful. After introducing yourself, you can ask something like, "Do you know where you're going?" or "Can I help you find where you're going?" Now, if you're sitting next to them in the sanctuary and worship is starting in 30 seconds, that question might not make sense. But if they're just walking in the door, and especially if they seem to be wandering aimlessly, offer to help. And then if they say, "I'm looking for this classroom," or "I'm looking for this event," it's ideal to walk with them, to show them where to go. This would be especially true if they have kids with them. Offering a hand to the youth room, elementary or preschool classroom, nursery or mother's room is a great idea. 4, don't treat people like a number. Maybe the most uncomfortable experience I've had at a church was in college, where I visited a church and was told, "Oh, We don't have many young people. Please come back and join our church. We really need you. I didn't feel welcomed. It felt desperate. And I'll speak on behalf of all the younger crowd. We can tell when people are excited to see us because we have a young family rather than because they genuinely want to see us. The problem isn't the very natural desire to see our church grow, but rather that it treats that person as a number. Whether it's their age or race or sexual orientation or any other attribute, we welcome others equally. We don't verbally point out those traits when we meet them. We don't want to overwhelm some people with anxious welcome and be indifferent to others. Oh, it's so nice to see someone who has insert characteristic. Come and visit. That might seem welcoming to us, but to others, it marks them as a number, not as a person. 5, do invite them to something specific. This one's pretty straightforward. It's one thing to be greeted nicely by someone. It's another for that person to ask for our email and ask if we want to sit with them at the potluck the following Sunday. It's one thing to have a friendly handshake after worship. It's another to have someone invite you to lunch out afterwards. If the situation presents itself, inviting a guest to a book club, Bible study, fellowship event, anything that would take place in public and be church related is a super generous but super meaningful gesture of hospitality. 6, don't guilt them. This one's also pretty straightforward, or at least should be, but don't be rude to people at church. I'm grateful that this is not ordinarily a problem at St. Barnabas, but it also isn't unheard of, so we should all work to keep each other accountable. If someone is sitting in the seats you usually sit in, I'll be blunt, it's never okay to ask them to move. All the other seats are just as good, and if it's that important to you, you can get there early the next week. If a newer member or visitor doesn't know a tradition or norm, politely show them. If someone leaves their coffee cup on the table as they get up to leave, you can say, "Can I show you where the dishwasher is? We usually put that away ourselves," rather than, "Can you clean up after yourself?" If a baby is crying ahead of you, we can be glad that young families have decided to worship with us. And if the situation is truly disruptive, our ushers are tasked with intervening. But you can politely ask, "Can I help you with anything?" rather than, "Please quiet your baby," or "You should step out." Odds are good they will step out and likely never come back. Don't be rude. Don't guilt. That makes Jesus happy. 7, do follow up. If you've introduced yourself to someone new, try to search them out the next week or two and tell them you're glad to see them again. Or if you've learned something about them when you met, take initiative to connect them further. "Hey, I remember you said you like singing. Can I introduce you to our music director?" Or, "Have you met our pastors yet? I'd love to introduce you." Having a second interaction with someone who is welcomed once reinforces that welcome that we showed the first time and also shows that we genuinely care about them being here. And 8, don't ask highly personal questions. When you meet someone for the first time at church, it's best to stick to fairly routine topics rather than delving into super deep waters right away. We'll get to cultural sensitivities in just a minute, but some questions can be asked with good intentions but be received as hostile by others. Good questions for small talk could include, "Do you live nearby? Have you been to church here before? What do you like to do for fun? Tell me about your family," and other universal questions. Any questions that directly or indirectly ask about nationality, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, economic status, or more should probably be avoided. This is not to say that we can't talk about those things at church, quite the opposite. But instead, those sorts of questions put guests on the defensive, and they raise their guard, and will usually make them wonder why you're asking those questions right off the bat. Maybe people like me aren't welcomed here if they're asking it. It's best to let newer members of our community share that information at their discretion. Let them bring it up, or to ask them only after a personal relationship has been developed. And of course, for all of these, look people in the eye, smile. Remember that you want to interact with people the way you want them to interact with you. That's what is at the heart of our theology of hospitality. Every person is made in the image of God and is equal in God's eyes. We welcome others because in others we encounter the divine. God's own image is in each person who walks through our doors. And so we greet them and welcome them and show hospitality, not because it is good for membership rolls and might bring in young families, but as an act of faith and demonstration of our love for our neighbor.
All people are equal in the eyes of God. However, in our society, people experience suffering because of their race, sexuality, and disability. As caregivers, we do not define our neighbors by these traits, but we must also recognize the life experiences people have because of them. Good caregivers navigate the fine line of treating people in minority groups just like anyone else, while also intentionally creating non-hostile space for issues of prejudice to be discussed. Additionally, good caregiving means learning the norms of historically marginalized groups so that caregivers do not unintentionally or unknowingly create a hostile environment. Put simply, being nice to everyone is not the same as giving them good care. At the heart of the conversation is power, or who has the right to claim space as theirs. In American society broadly, norms privilege being white over being non-white, being straight over being LGBTQ, being male over being female, being strong and athletic over having disabilities, and being young over old, among other traits. This doesn't mean that you or I created this system or that we support it, but rather it means that people in other groups experience marginalizations along these lines. In whatever ways we can, we are called to build the church up to be different. Below are several lists of cultural competencies that might prove useful in congregational caregiving. As members of the church, we hope to internalize them and reference them when we encounter anyone in our congregation for whom they apply. Side note here, they are drawn from Injustice and Care of the Souls, Taking Oppression Seriously in Pastoral Care, edited by Cheryl A. Kujawa Holbrook and Karen B. Montagno. Suggestions that apply especially to non-English speakers. African, Latin American, and other immigrant communities call Richardson home. Whether welcoming folks to worship on Sundays, at mission events, or any other time, there is value in attempting to overcome language barriers by using other people's native language. Even if we do so poorly, often the mere attempt to communicate to a person in their native language is understood as a welcoming gesture. If you know even a little bit of the language being spoken, asking, "Do you speak English?" in that language is a helpful first step. If you're entirely unfamiliar with someone else's language, but know someone nearby who might be familiar with it, consider asking for help. Your phone can also be your best friend. Google Translate is imperfect, but it can be used to quickly type out a greeting or a question. You can show your phone to the other person and invite them to respond as well. If someone who speaks another language wishes to visit, and we know ahead of time, there are translation services via phone, Zoom, etc., that we can arrange beforehand to accommodate them. Here are some suggestions that apply especially to LGBTQ community. If you're unsure about someone's relationship to another, for example, if two men visit the church together or two women visit the church together, and it's unclear if they are friends, family, or spouses, ask rather than assume the relationship. For example, rather than saying, "Are you two friends?" ask, "How do you two know each other?" Even if you suspect gender or sexuality differences, it is not our right to know. In some cases, folks may not be out yet and looking for a community where they can undergo that process with support. Either way, we need to maintain their privacy. If you encounter an individual whose gender identity is not abundantly clear, avoid using he or she pronouns. A singular they is helpful. Do not be afraid to ask, which pronouns do you prefer? Don't assume that you can tell if someone is transgender. Remember, the church has historically been and is overwhelmingly still to this day a hostile place for LGBTQ people. Our vocal welcome is a witness in and of itself. One's sexuality or gender does not define them. So if we are looking to include them in our ministries or introduce them to other members of the church, focus on the whole person. Once they know they are accepted in our space, it can be hurtful to be pigeonholed into a certain group only with other LGBTQ members. Here are some suggestions that apply especially to disabled within our community. Pay attention to ways in which someone might be inhibited from fully participating in the life of the congregation. Disability is broadly defined as physical, mental, medical, or other impediments to how one might otherwise function. Again, our purpose is to communicate verbally and non-verbally that all are invited into our space. If someone's disability is obvious enough for you to notice, odds are others notice too. Now, some will avoid those disabilities by instinct, either out of discomfort or out of fear of saying or doing something embarrassing. So make it a habit to specifically welcome folks instead. In some cases, disability is chronic, and continued focus on it would be offensive. Longtime visitors or members whose welcome is not in question probably don't need repeated attention, and that is just fine. In many cases, disability is temporary. For example, someone may need crutches or a wheelchair after a surgery, or immune system vulnerability during chemotherapy. In most cases, it is very appropriate to ask directly what accommodations we can make as a church to include them in ministry. The most common disability encountered in churches is with vision or hearing issues. If these issues present themselves, they can easily be accommodated. Take care to ask whether an usher or pastor can assist. If you're in doubt about how to best show love to someone, just ask, tactfully, of course. Example, Jen, is there anything I can do to be helpful today? Could be a meaningful cue to a visitor that you want to assist them, but don't want to assume what they need. If someone is accompanied by a caregiver, a parent, a spouse, or other, it's best to include them in conversations about accommodation. The caregiver will probably best know how to do so. These tips are helpful, but they don't encompass everything we should be aware of when it comes to showing hospitality. If you have any specific questions, your pastors are happy to assist. All of these ideas and best practices are a lot for one sitting. To be completely honest, a lot of it is from training for clergy, so it's more than is ordinarily asked of lay leaders. But that doesn't mean it isn't helpful, or that God doesn't call us to care for one another in these sorts of ways. Again, at the heart of it all is our desire to show genuine hospitality to all people. And that requires being intentional, having warm welcome at the front of our mind when we gather as a church, especially for our leaders. Now, let us say one last thing. Nobody is going to get it right all the time. Nobody's perfect, which is why we extend grace upon grace to each other and to ourselves. The important thing that we draw from our faith in Christ is the intention of being hospitable and welcoming one another with peace.
Thank you for taking part in this training, and blessings on your ministries of welcome and on the congregation of St. Barnabas.